The chamber was electric that day, the air thick with tension and television lights glaring down like judgment. The crowd of reporters leaned forward in their seats, ready to capture every moment of the unfolding political storm. Senator John Kennedy stood at the podium, his voice calm but firm, addressing the heated immigration bill that had divided Congress. Across the room, Representative Ilhan Omar rose from her seat, her eyes sharp, her tone unyielding. "Sit down, boy," she snapped, her words slicing through the room like lightning. Gasps rippled through the chamber, cameras flashing, and America froze in collective shock. For a moment, Kennedy didn't move, didn't blink, just stared back with a silence that spoke louder than any retort. The crowd waited for a rebuttal, for the Southern senator's temper to flare, for politics to become another public brawl. But instead, he smiled softly, adjusted his tie, and said nothing. That silence would become the most powerful statement of his career. When Kennedy finally spoke, his voice carried the calm steadiness of a man who had been raised on humility, not pride. "Representative Omar," he said, "where I come from, we treat each other with respect, even when we disagree." His words weren't sharp or defensive. They were disarming, almost fatherly, as if he were speaking to the whole nation rather than one opponent. The chamber fell quiet again, the heat of anger replaced by something more complicated: reflection. Omar shifted in her seat, clearly taken aback by his composure, by the way he didn't take the bait. The cameras zoomed in, catching the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Kennedy continued, speaking not as a politician, but as a man who'd known struggle, who'd seen division destroy good people. "I believe we can disagree without disrespect," he said, "because that's what America is supposed to mean." It wasn't the fiery response the media expected. It was something far deeper. That moment didn't just make headlines, it split the country open. Social media erupted, half praising Omar for standing her ground, the other half lauding Kennedy for his restraint. But behind the noise, something quieter and more profound was happening. Kennedy's words began circulating in classrooms, in churches, in small town halls across America. People were tired of anger, tired of shouting, tired of leaders who mirrored the worst parts of themselves. And somehow Kennedy's response, simple and unplanned, gave them something to hold on to. "Disagree without disrespect" became a phrase people began to repeat, paint on signs, and share online. It was as if America had been waiting for someone to remind them what decency looked like. For Omar, however, the moment hit differently. She hadn't meant for the insult to define her, but it did. The backlash was fierce. Editorials, interviews, and political opponents using her words to paint her as cold and cruel. In private, she struggled with regret. She thought about her childhood, the years in a refugee camp, the feeling of never being heard or respected. That anger had followed her into adulthood, and for the first time she saw how it might have blinded her. She reached out to Kennedy, requesting a private meeting away from cameras, away from politics. To her surprise, he agreed immediately. When she arrived at his office, he greeted her not as an enemy, but as a colleague. "We've both had our share of hard roads," he told her. "Maybe it's time we start walking one together." Their conversation stretched for hours, weaving through stories of loss, faith, and identity. Kennedy shared tales of growing up poor in Louisiana, of watching his father lose everything but his dignity. Omar spoke about the pain of being misunderstood in a land she'd come to love. They laughed at the absurdity of how one moment could turn the nation upside down. By the time she left, something had shifted between them. Not friendship exactly, but mutual respect. For both, the meeting became a quiet turning point, a reminder that real change begins not in grand speeches, but in human connection. When the story eventually leaked, people were surprised to hear there had been no anger. No politics, just two people talking. Weeks later, Kennedy took the floor again, this time with Omar sitting directly behind him. The nation tuned in, curious to see what would happen next. "Last month," Kennedy began, "we had a disagreement that taught us both something." His eyes met hers and she nodded slightly. "It taught us that America doesn't need louder voices. It needs better listeners." The room was silent. "We don't fix division by shouting. We fix it by understanding." The audience erupted in applause, some standing, others wiping away tears. For a moment, the constant noise of politics quieted, replaced by something rare, hope. The two shook hands afterward, and though simple, that gesture rippled across the country like a wave. Media analysts called it a miracle moment, something America hadn't seen in years, a genuine act of reconciliation. Schools began discussing it in civics classes, and late-night hosts replayed the footage again and again. But for Kennedy and Omar, it wasn't about the attention. It was about what it meant for the country. They started working together on small bipartisan initiatives, often drawing criticism from their own parties. "Unity doesn't win elections," one consultant told Kennedy. "Maybe not," he replied, "but it might just save the country." That became his quiet mantra, one that Omar soon echoed in her own speeches. Their unlikely partnership became a symbol of what could happen when pride gives way to purpose. Still, not everyone was pleased. Political extremes on both sides accused them of betrayal. Kennedy was labeled soft, Omar a sellout, but they pressed on, undeterred. They appeared together at town halls, sitting side by side, facing tough questions from citizens who'd lost faith in politics. Kennedy often spoke first, telling the crowd that disagreement was not the enemy. Disrespect was. Omar would follow, her tone more measured than before, admitting that sometimes passion can overshadow principle. People listened, not because they agreed with everything, but because for once they saw two leaders who treated each other like human beings. And that was enough to start changing hearts. Months later, the two stood together at a rally in Washington, their message simple. Listen before you speak. Respect before you judge. The crowd, tens of thousands strong, cheered not for a party, but for an idea. Kennedy leaned toward the microphone, his southern drawl steady and warm. "We can't heal if we keep fighting the same fight," he said. "But we can start if we learn to listen again." Omar followed, her voice cracking slightly with emotion. "I learned that courage isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about having the strength to admit when you were wrong." The applause was thunderous. That night, for the first time in years, America felt united by something deeper than politics. As the months turned into years, that single exchange, those 3 words, "Sit down, boy," became less a scandal and more a story of redemption. Schools taught it as an example of how humility can diffuse hate. Commentators cited it as the turning point of a new era in civility. And in quieter corners of America, kitchens, classrooms, churches, people talked about it not as politics, but as humanity rediscovered. Kennedy often said, "Sometimes the loudest voices teach us the quietest lessons." And Omar would add, "Sometimes the greatest power isn't in standing tall, but in sitting down and listening." In the end, their story became a testament to the strength that comes from grace. America didn't change overnight, but something in its heart softened. 2 people who had once stood on opposite sides of everything learned to stand together for something greater. The insult that once divided them became the spark that reminded the nation of its better angels. And as the sun set over the Capitol, both Kennedy and Omar walked out side by side, proof that even in a world of noise, the quiet power of respect can still shock the world and heal it.